A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to Super Foam Flying. Here in HJN, I really do have a lot to offer when it comes to Nerf blasters as a whole. And I do, in fact, have plenty to talk about when discussing various lineups, as well as different kinds of blasters that originate from these lineups. If one in particular, especially from the year 2021, might stand out the most to me, then I hate to admit it, but it turns out that the so-called Recon Mark III actually does seem to do better than the likes of almost the majority of the others. Especially for the fact that we practically assumed that the Modulus line was dead, pretty much for good. And especially after 2018, when the only things that we got in 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and all the way up to today, we basically got little to nothing each and every single year that passed on after 2018, when their last biggest hits included the Modulus Extender and Pulverizer, which, as you can see right here, I've talked a bit about the Pulverizer before, and I have yet to get my hands on an Extender, but of course, after 2018, there was hardly anything else. Apart from the appearance of the Shadow ICS-6, which was the second and pretty much the last of the Modulus Ghost Ops line. But then eventually in 2021, we ended up getting some news about a new Modulus Ghost Ops pack, which were just a few attachments. But then we eventually got wind of this, the Recon Mark III. Basically an upgrade over the Mark II, which in and of itself is supposedly the Modulus reskin / redesign of the N-Strike Recon CS6. But might I just ask, at least for just once, how can you call it a Recon Mark II or Mark III or Mark IV, assuming if we're ever going to get one like that, when it's not even close to the original design of the Recon CS6 itself? I feel like that part of the reason is just for the fact that this actually does come with different attachments. And it might be okay on some ends, but think about what happened when they tried to bring the Recon into other lineups. They made a Recon-esque blaster for the Elite line, which is known as the Delta Trooper, but of course I gave that one a new name because of various complications revolving around naming elsewhere. And then eventually we cannot forget about the Echo CS10, which was part of 2.0. None of those are even called Recons. They were in fact inspired by the original design of the Recon. But this one literally takes the name Recon and attempts to make it better than the Recon. So I don't really know if I should complain here or if I should do something else entirely. But at this point in time, it's not about the name that I'm here to talk about here. It's about the blaster itself. At least for a Mark III, an upgrade over the original Recon CS6, I actually call this the Insurgent. If you remember from my episode on the Modulus lineup tier list, in an episode of a series known as Tears of the Clown, where I've talked about blasters across many different lineups throughout 2022, then you probably would know that this was one of the last that I ever talked about. I gave it a really good score, and this is pretty much where I'm going to detail on that and back up this particular claim. Because first of all, at least because of the fact that this is based off the Recon CS6, and I'm a huge fan of that blaster entirely. It was one of the first blasters I ever got my hands on that was more modular, pretty much, in which that it came with its own sort of attachments. It came with a front barrel, it came with a stock, and it came with a laser that attached to the bottom of the barrel, as well as a flip-up sight for the top. In this particular case, we seem to be getting a bit of a revival of that sort of vibe that had been out for well over 10 years. And I had the Recon CS6 for a long time. I was practically having my own Recon since the very first day it arrived on the marketplace. And so when you really have someone out there who is able to pick up Nerf blasters right when they come out, I mean, actually in any particular way, I still am doing just that. As a matter of fact, there have been a good handful of brand new blasters here in 2025 that I have gotten my hands on. They might not be visible here on the wall. That's because I'm trying to do some work on it for the moment. But in any case, that's still a lot to talk about. But in any case, they call this the Mark III because it's after Mark II, which was after the original Recon. But I called the second one the Rover, and this is the Insurgent. So, definitely don't pay attention to this placard on the side here that showcases what its real name is. But in all seriousness, I do consider this a great blaster because, first of all, when you look at this in general, I mean, think about it. You're getting the same kind of feeling that you might get from handling the original Recon back in 09 and 10, as well as 2011, 2012, pretty much. Depending on how long you've actually had an N-Strike Recon CS6, it might feel different to some of you, but the Recon CS6 in my life was incredible. For the fact that it was modular, for the fact that it got decent performance, at least for the time period that I've owned it in, and for the fact that it actually shot up in value insanely well. I mean, it's one of the most common blasters that you could have found out there in the marketplace, but yet it is, in fact, very valuable nowadays, especially when it's new. And so, the fact that I was able to actually sell off my Recon for such an impressive price tag of almost 40 bucks, and that's not including the shipping costs, I was able to get a great value out of it. It's almost like I made some extra cash for myself, while still earning myself back the money I paid for it when I first bought it. But in this particular case, being a more recent iteration of a Recon CS6-esque blaster, as opposed to what we got with other blasters out there, the Delta Trooper I've called the Sierra Major, specifically. But for an Elite blaster, that thing actually did pretty well, at least for trying to revive the Recon CS6 as a whole. But then, of course, the Retaliator came around, had the same exact sort of shape, size, but some different attachments and all that. And in all serious cases, with CS6 blasters out there, this right here, the Insurgent, actually does a little bit better because, first of all, exclusive modulus attachments, including this silencer sort of barrel, as well as this shield which can fold up and down like so. It's almost like the shield that could block incoming water based on the Super Soaker Lightning Storm. And if that wasn't cool enough, then well, you basically have yourself a slight recolor of the Regulator's stock, which can hold an extra clip. And so, I guess with that in mind, that probably just concludes a good handful of this entire review that I have to talk about this as a whole. But if there's other things I might have to talk about based on this exact thing entirely, then well, let's just see how this thing works based on, well, firing. I guess one con about this is that, well, with the shield on, it doesn't really make it much easier to prime, so yeah, that pretty much works a little bit better. Also, with the priming on hand, it does feel like that it slows down and stops at certain points, probably because it's still kind of fresh. It's not necessarily brand new, like it was still in its original wrapping, but I still was able to get it somewhat brand new, pretty much. It still needs some time to break in, as it seems, which could explain why it's a little bit stiff up here. And so, okay, that looks like it freed it up a bit. So, in any case, I just simply got this thing to work properly, and now, as you can see, the priming itself works a lot better now. And I feel like that another big thing I could probably point out about this is just the fact that, well, the modulus exclusive color lineup out there, including the white, dark gray, orange, and highlighter green sort of colors, all of these seem to blend together rather nicely, at least for a modulus iteration of the Recon CS6. And to really get to know the fact that this came with its own sort of attachments, many of which just seem to be remolds of certain attachments that had existed before then. The shield, for example, is basically just a different color for the most part. It's existed in the modulus line before, as you can see by its design, with the specific sort of reticle that appears right here. Except it's just a different color, just so it can match up with the color scheme of this blaster. And as I've said before, the stock is basically just a regulator stock with the highlighter green color right here on the back end of it, just so it can match up with the rest of the color scheme. And we also can't forget the fact that 12 dart clips were pretty much existent since the Elite line came into play in 2012, meaning that this blaster hardly does anything original in terms of this aspect. And then you have the silencer barrel, which we've seen as standalone attachments that you could buy on eBay for cheap or otherwise. But I guess to conclusify this whole thing entirely, this is still a great blaster. A great blaster for the most part that actually gives us the same sort of feel as the Recon CS6 did, and not to mention the fact, oh, That didn't sound good. So I guess in any case, this is pretty much just how I feel about this blaster entirely, and then some. But if you want to see more go down on my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.